Hey friends, welcome back to Fantasy Wash. Today we are going to be asking the question, is The Great Hunt by Robert Jordan a better story overall than Eye of the World? Let's jump in. If you saw my last video, which I can link here, I talked about whether or not Eye of the World or Wheel of Time in general was an original idea. And while I determined that, spoiler alert, it's not, the story itself still has merit and is an interesting story nonetheless. I did have several issues with Eye of the World, specifically being some of the character work overall, and a few points of the plot were a little bit of an issue for me. So going into book 2, The Great Hunt, I was told by several people that know me that I will enjoy this book better. And I do think that they were right. I did enjoy The Great Hunt more than Eye of the World. However, I still feel that there are points that should be discussed overall. So I'm going to separate this video into 2 sections, I think. At least I think it's going to be 2 sections now. That might change. Our first section is going to be overall plot, what I thought of what happened in the story, discussions about that, and part 2 is going to be discussions of characters, character work, and character development or lack thereof. So as this is going to be an in-depth discussion, I'm going to preface this and say this is going to be a spoiler-heavy discussion, so if you are not wanting to be spoiled for The Great Hunt or possibly, I find it unlikely, but possibly spoiled for season 2 of Wheel of Time on Amazon, I would suggest that you stop listening now. But if you are fine with those things, then we are going to commence our discussion about overall plot of this story now. So as the book is entitled The Great Hunt, it implies that there is a hunt for something. I knew from the first book they were talking about the Horn of Valere and the hunt for the Horn of Valere. So as soon as I saw the title for this book, I was like, it's definitely the Horn of Valere that they're hunting for. And it is a much more interesting and engaging story to me than Eye of the World. The hunt itself is just one subsect of our overall story for this second book. However, it's kind of at the core because one of our dark friends, aka bad guys from book 1, Pat and Fane, manages to escape with the dagger from Shatter Logoth that is tied to Matt, in addition to the Horn of Valere. Now, the Horn of Valere is supposed to be from the Age of Legends. Whomever blows the horn is then tied to it for their entire life. And by blowing the horn, you are calling upon heroes from the Age of Legends to come and fight by your side. These are heroes of the dead. This is mostly talked about in context of Archer Hawkwing, who was a Taviran who was very integral to the wheel and being heroic, and a lot of the wheel was said to have woven itself around him because he was such an important Taviran character. This is one part of our story, but it is at the beginning of the story. And we have all of our characters kind of centered in one place, especially because we now have the arrival of the Amerlin seat to where we finished our last book, Eye of the World. We are in the Borderlands, which is where Lan is from. And we see that some people are going to be going after the horn and some people are not. Now, the group of people that are going to be proceeding to track down the horn are Rand, Matt, Perrin. There is a Shienaran called Ingtar, and there is another Shienaran whose name is Huron, who is... He's a hero in his own right, but he's not quite a commander or general. He is more subservient to Rand than he is to anything else in the story. But that is our primary group. Our secondary group are the group of women who are going to be headed back to Tar Valon for training. The first book, our characters were also separated. We saw that Matt and Rand were off on their journey, meeting a million dark friends. We had Perrin and Egwene that were with the Tinkers, and Nynaeve was with Lan and Moraine, developing her very questionable romantic interest in Lan. We'll get to that later. In this story, I like that we are starting to see the development of what it takes to become an Aes Sedai and what life at the Tower is. And that plot develops through the characters of Nynaeve, Egwene, and eventually Elaine and Min, but we will get to them in a few minutes. In the story for the Hunt of the Horn, it is Interesting because we have the dynamic of the three boys that are now back together, Rand, Matt, and Perrin. And this is going to kind of jump the gun a little bit in terms of discussing characters and character developments, but I think that we need to talk about relationships, so we're going to talk about relationships now. I'm going to come out and say it now, even though it is book 2. I don't think that Robert Jordan writes good friendships or good relationships. The dynamic between these three boys is highly toxic and highly troublesome. From the perspective of Rand, who is now being touched by the source and is very slowly starting to go insane. He's hearing voices. He doesn't really feel like he can trust what's going on around him. He's paranoid. It is problematic from Rand's perspective. However, from Perrin's perspective, Perrin is jealous of the fact that Rand and Egwene have a thing going on. Matt is seemingly jealous of the fact that Rand seems to be this new person of elevated status. There is constant jealousy, friction, and tension between the three of them, and more often than not ends up being Perrin and Matt versus Rand. But it is a dynamic that simply doesn't work. We know that these three have been friends since childhood. They are supposed to have a very strong bond, so much so that Rand is choosing to go with them rather than break off on his own to ensure that Matt is reunited with the dagger from Shatter Logoth, because if he is not, it is going to end and result in his death. But you just don't get that from these characters. I don't buy that these three genuinely like each other in a way that is sincere, is a long-lasting friendship, and is something that will carry through these books. It's just not something that I can really get on board with. If you're interested in my comparison of the relationships in the show versus the book, Christopher Navo and I had a conversation about this. We are having chats every week about rewatching the show, comparing it to the book, and I can link that here for our first episode. We will be doing episodes 2 and 3 this upcoming Sunday at 7 Eastern if you're interested in more about that. But continuing on. From the perspective of the girls, the way that Jordan writes female friendships was very much reminiscent to a song from The Hangover.
And we're the three best friends that anybody could have. We're the three best friends that anyone could have. We're gonna do things all the time together. Just because we're not on a bachelor party doesn't mean that we can't hang out.
Except this, I just don't buy. When Nynaeve and Egwene arrive in Tar Valon, which I find to be very interesting because we're now starting to see the dynamics of how White Tower works, the background to Aes Sedai, what it takes to become an Aes Sedai. That part is interesting. You re-meet Elaine and we re-meet Min. Min we had encountered in Baerlon in the first book, and obviously we met Elaine when Rand is in Caemlyn and falls into the palace grounds because he wants to get a look at Logain as he is being paraded through the streets before he is about to be stilled. My major issue with this is that it all comes back to Rand. The girls have very little in common besides Rand. Despite the fact that they are all wanting to train and become Aes Sedai, the string that is holding them together is that each of them independently love Rand, save for Nynaeve, who is still for some reason obsessed with Lan, which I don't quite understand because they've barely spoken to each other, but that's besides the point. It is really irksome when you read a story in which you have a protagonist that is on a very clear hero's journey, and that is not the problem. The problem is that when every female character falls in love with that character for seemingly no reason. It makes sense in terms of Egwene and Rand, as they have known each other since childhood, and this is established in Eye of the World. It was always presumed that the two of them would end up together. That's fine. The problem is that Elaine has known Rand for all of 2 minutes and decided that he is absolutely worth having and that she hopes Egwene will marry her brother so that she can marry Rand. And then later on in the book, in The Great Hunt, when Min encounters Rand for a second time, she says, I hope you'll choose me, even though I know that there will be many, many others. It's just ridiculous. I'm sorry. This is absolutely ridiculous. You do not need every female character fawning over a male character, in addition to the fawning over the protagonist. It doesn't make sense for how little time these people have known each other. And that brings us back again to the relationship of Nynaeve and Lan. One of the things that I thought was interesting in this story is that when we're seeing more of the storyline taking place at Tar Valon, we understand that Aes Sedai, to become an Aes Sedai, you have to undergo this crazy test, which made me think of the Kobayashi Maru from Star Trek.
All ships destroyed, Captain.
Begin rescue of the stranded crew. So, we've managed to eliminate all enemy ships. No one on board was injured, and the successful rescue of the Kobayashi Maru crew is underway.
But in that test, you are shown images, scenarios, and you have to remember that it is in fact not real and that you need to escape from it. Nynaeve is in her test and sees that she is married to Lan and they have children, and this is so wonderful, and none of it makes sense because we know from earlier in this book that the two of them aren't even really talking to each other. So why is this even a thing? It's not. Like, this should not be a scenario. And when we look at the female characters that are interesting in this book and their relationships, you have Moraine and Lan's relationship, which from the first book was, I thought, very good because you understand that it is simply not a romantic relationship, which is something that I greatly appreciate, but it is something that goes deeper than that. The Warder and Aes Sedai bond is so integrally linked and entwined that they are each other's person, but that doesn't mean, unless you're a Green Aja, that you have to be romantically linked to them, and they are most certainly not. And we have Moraine as a character who is very purposeful, she's determined, she's assertive, who is now questioning Lan's bond because she anticipates that Lan will ask to break his bond so that he can be bonded to Nynaeve. No, these things just don't make sense. The relationships in these books do not make sense. So in terms of whether or not The Great Hunt is better for relationships versus Eye of the World, I'd say it's slightly worse, if not the same. It's just an exaggerated, prolonged version of what we saw in Eye of the World, but that doesn't mean that some of the new characters we meet in this story aren't very interesting, and I want to talk about the characters now. My favorite new character from this story is Varen. I understand that Varen is a brown Aja. I've done the test. I myself am a brown Aja, so I'm probably just like projecting that I like her so much, but she is a very interesting character. I really enjoyed all of the interactions with Varen, and I think that she is one of the few well-written female characters so far in The Wheel of Time. So I enjoyed reading about Varen. I enjoyed Ingtar so much in the book. I thought that he was a really interesting character, and I also enjoy Liandrin. So Huron is kind of a fine character for me. He didn't really drive the plot for me or anything like that. I kept thinking to myself, he's probably going to be a dark friend because one of these people is going to have to be a dark friend. And then the last character that was introduced that I felt was super important and super relevant was Selene. So I want to talk about these in order. So first and foremost, Varen. I liked the dynamic of Varen with the other Aja, with the Emerald Seat, with the girls as a whole, with the boys. I thought that Varen just was a very well-rounded character, even though she's in the story for a brief amount of time. I felt that the amount of time she was given, it was all quality content. And I appreciated that because up until this point, I was starting to really lose faith that any female character could be written well in this story. And I had a really hard time with that. So with Liandrin and Ingtar, I am greatly disappointed that Liandrin is a dark friend and a Black Aja. And the reason that I say this is because I think it would have been so much more interesting to have a strong female character who is of the Red Aja and is so firm in her belief system and hates men, hates the fact that they can channel, but is not a dark friend. She's just not a nice person. It's okay to have characters that are morally gray. And for the most part, that seems to be generally lacking in this series. I find that characters are either pretty good or they're pretty bad. There's not really a line to blur them. And Leandrin, I feel like, could have been a very good case study for that for this series. And I was really disappointed to find out that she was a dark friend. Now, in terms of Ingtar, I wasn't surprised by this because I was expecting that it was going to be either him or Huron. I thought it was going to be Huron. It turned out to be Ingtar, which was kind of disappointing just because like you're rooting for the character, but he does come back to the light in the end. So hurrah, that's all great. But I thought that that was kind of a bummer overall. Now, Celine. When we met Celine, I don't know if Robert Jordan was intending for this to be super apparent or of the fact that I've become a paranoid reader since reading Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere and I'm consistently looking for clues. But I knew immediately that Celine was Lanfear. And that's because the only female Forsaken that has been mentioned up until this point is Lanfear. Therefore, it makes sense when we meet this woman who clearly is not a regular woman. She's clearly not Aes Sedai. There is something mysterious, mystical about her. It's 100% Lanfear. So when she marks Rand at the end of the story and confirms to Min that she is Lanfear, I was not at all shocked by this. I don't know if there was supposed to be a shock value or if it was more so that Robert Jordan was trusting his audience and saying, I've dropped this clue that there is a female Forsaken. Do you get it now? Or if it was meant to be more of a, hey, surprise, I'm Lanfear. I was kind of disappointed in the fact that I felt no surprise with that because I do like to be surprised as a reader, but at the same time too, I don't know the intention behind what Robert Jordan was going for, so I can't be too critical of that. I am interested to see more where the Celine character / Lanfear character goes. I am really interested in the Forsaken. I think that this is something that is going to be really interesting going forward. So in terms of characters that we see more of in this story, I felt that I was more interested in the characters in this book than I was with Eye of the World. In Eye of the World, I love Tom Maryland. Tom Maryland is back in The Great Hunt, which I appreciate. I was interested in Rand's storyline significantly. I was interested in Lanfear's storyline, Ingtar's storyline, Baron's storyline, Maureen's storyline. So I'd say overall for characters that I am interested in pursuing with, The Great Hunt was overall better for me than Eye of the World. Now I want to come back to plot and overall things that I really enjoyed from this story, and I think amplified my experience of reading this more so than reading Eye of the World. In Eye of the World, we're kind of just given a bunch of background, and it's not really fully fleshed out background, which I understand this is a very long series, so you're not going to get everything in one book, but the Shanten in book 2 are fascinating. I really like the plot with the Shanten, and I love the plot with the Horn and the culmination of this book. I thought that this was a much stronger pulling you into the story than Eye of the World was, and the culmination of Eye of the World, because the end of Eye of the World can be somewhat confusing because Rand is sitting there thinking that they've defeated the Dark One. In reality, they haven't. They've just released Ishmael. However, in this, it's that there is a very clear nemesis, a tangible nemesis, and what they do is terrifying. This was the first time in the story that I was sympathetic to Nynev's character because she is trying to rescue Egwene, and I could not help feeling invested in this part of the story. The imagery of being on the leashes, feeling what your controller feels, I thought this was a really fascinating plot point, and I'm definitely curious to see how this continues further on in the story. And the blowing of the horn was so good. I loved the arrival of Arthur Hawkwing and the heroes of legend and the fact that Rand has to have the banner of the dragon. I liked all of these things coming to fruition at the end of this story. This, to me, solidified The Great Hunt as a very good story and definitely nudged it ahead for me of Eye of the World. There were, of course, other little things in this book that I thought were interesting, traveling through the ways and seeing how places can be affected via time and space, how there's multiple dimensions, multiple universes. I thought that was really interesting. We got more detail in this story of the politics, the background, and I understand that you are able to do that in a book 2 because book 1 typically is there to help lay foundation so that you can build upon the world. However, I felt that book 1 compared to book 2 is just nowhere near as good. For me, if I were to sit down and say to someone, you should read one of these 2 books, it would be book 2. I understand that you need some of the information from book 1. However, I think that Robert Jordan really was starting to find his rhythm, style, and voice in book 2, even though I think that there are still several issues that need to be addressed, primarily character work and the fact that certain relationships just simply do not make sense. However, I'm happy to say that I am now about 30% into book 3, The Dragon Reborn, and I do feel that certain characters and characteristic traits, specifically Nynaeve, are becoming less grating and less irritating and are starting to make more sense for the overall plot of the story. I think that sometimes Jordan kind of is maybe thinking too far ahead in the future and isn't justifying their reasoning now and in the moment. And the main thing that I would say for that is the issues that the kids from Emmonsfield have with Moraine. It doesn't make sense because there isn't enough background given as to why Nynaeve hates Moraine with a passion. Like when she's going in for her test to become one of the accepted in the White Tower, her motivation is to prove Moraine wrong and that she can do it and that she can overpower Moraine. You sit there and you go, okay, but why do you actually hate her this much? It doesn't make sense. So I feel that in some cases, Jordan maybe forgot to give background and detail to the things that matter and instead gave hyper detail to things like split riding dresses or braid tugging and things like that. So I feel that sometimes it misses the mark, but on other times, like at the end of The Great Hunt, he absolutely hits the mark and it is very, very well done. Overall, I would say that I very much enjoyed The Great Hunt. I liked it substantially better than Eye of the World. I am enjoying so far The Dragon Reborn. I am curious to keep going with this. Let me know in the comments below if you have read Eye of the World and The Great Hunt and which one you preferred. Are you excited to see how this is going to plan out for season 2 of Wheel of Time? You can let me know below. Just as a reminder that Christopher Navo and I are doing our rewatch of season 1 in the lead up to season 2 premiering on September 1st. At that point, every week we will be doing a live show to discuss the differences between the books and the show and our overall feelings. So those will be live so you guys can engage with us and chat with us about it. And if you like content like this, you can always hit like and subscribe and leave a comment down below. And if you'd like to find me on Instagram to see what I'm reading or to chat about stuff, you can find me at Fantasy Awash. And as always, I will see you next time. Bye. Just a little PSA in case you are interested, I am part of a Discord that the BookTube class of 2023 has started. You can find that in the description down below. See you next time.